pretty much just got on a plane with 9 big suitcases, this wave of moisture from player to coach, the Wild West. Yeah, I'll pay for something that's tangible. Manhattan on steroids. Coach is not about being better than you are, it's about making you better.
Scott, thank you so much for your time. It's been
Absolutely.
a pleasure to have you here and to find out more about what you do and to hear your insights. You've been in China for quite a long time. You're one of those who spent here really.
It depends what you consider a long time, but yeah, I'm actually starting to believe that I've been here for a little while.
Definitely not a couple of years.
Yes, for sure.
So what's your Asia story and how did you end up living in China?
So let's see. So, I mean, Asia, first time was 1999.
Oh, wow.
I had a boss who basically said, I need you on a plane next week to Hong Kong. We're going to do a joint venture there. You need to go help negotiate the deal. And August 1999, get on a plane, full suit. I remember that in those days, that was what was called for. I was in the telecom industry, and get off a plane in Hong Kong in August, and this wave of moisture hits me for the first time, and being from California, not something I was Southern California in particular, not something I was particularly used to, but just sort of went from there. From Hong Kong to Seoul to Tokyo to Singapore to a number of other places, doing deals and getting used to Asia. The first trip to Beijing was in 2001. Mm-hmm. As a matter of fact, stayed at the Kerry Center, which was our joint venture partner from Hong Kong, owned that, and that was when the Kerry Center had just opened, the Kerry Center Hotel, brand new, and all 4 sides was like dirt. The CBD of Beijing was nothing like what
Starbucks?
You know what? Starbucks was definitely in China then, but it wasn't like, today, like every corner had a Starbucks, right? And it was just, it was different. So my China journey, in a way, then really began in earnest several years later. I did a startup in Shanghai / Shenyang, of all places, in 0304, and I was still on planes all the time. That didn't succeed, but in 05 I said, it's time to be here. Mm-hmm. And pretty much just got on a plane with 9 big suitcases, back when you could actually do that and it didn't cost an arm and a leg, and moved here. And job number 1 was learn Chinese. Mm-hmm. So I went from there.
Successful?
Yeah, I mean, I studied for a full year and was able to manage teams in Chinese for several years thereafter. So yeah, I would say successful.
Impressive.
It's one of those things where it's always a spectrum. I'll never be native, but fully conversational.
On your LinkedIn, you wrote that Shanghai is Manhattan on steroids. Do you still think so, regarding the situation that we have now, and we're recording this in November?
Yeah,
2022.
So here's, I think that you got to look at the timeline, right? So I wrote that on my LinkedIn back in 05, shortly after moving here, right? And at that time, it absolutely felt like Manhattan on steroids. Now, everything's relative. If you go from 05 to, let's say, 2019, by 2019, it was even more so, much more so. Mm-hmm. A dynamic, world-class city. And the COVID period obviously has created tremendous challenges. Although, frankly, for a good part of it, as you know, we were probably in the best city in the world to be living in, because during the better part of this COVID period, Shanghai was still kind of thriving, even though it was closed off to a great extent to the rest of the world. And then, yes, this year the lockdowns and everything else has really had a significant impact. A lot of people have left, both foreigners and Chinese. The dynamism, has been dampened significantly. But I came back after, as you know, just being out for several months, with this idea that, I'm buying an option. And for me, it's a 3-year option. 2025 is a meaningful year for me anyway, because of the plans that I've got with my wife and for our family. So the way I see it, either that option is going to be in the money in the next few years, or it'll expire worthless and we'll move somewhere else. But I'm betting, and that's why we came back. I'm betting that there's a really good chance that we get back into the money, so to speak. That might not be exactly the same as it was 2019, but in some way or another, that we get back to a growth period. And frankly, I believe that in order to do that, the government's going to have to do a lot of the same kinds of things in terms of incentives that they did back in the early 2000s, and that's going to create opportunity.
You've been part of many teams, companies across the globe. Which one or which ones had the best and biggest impact on your career, your professional development, and why?
That's always a good question. I mean, the journey that you go through, right, has so many different twists and turns and ups and downs. I mean, all of us look back and we try to sort of make sense of our career journey by putting it in a linear form, but it, of course, was never really linear when you were living it. That said, I do think I was lucky. My early career, I had experiences that gave me not just tools, but a perspective on doing business, on building things that was really helpful. So, I would say back in the mid-90s, I spent a stint at Deloitte Consulting doing strategy consulting for telecom, media, and technology businesses. And the one takeaway from there that was invaluable, or has been invaluable all the way through my career, is that I learned have laptop, will travel. It's a mentality, really, when it comes down to it. But it's the mentality of, I can be on a plane, I can be in a shared office space, I can be in a coffee shop, and I can be every bit as productive. I really believe that, as if I'm sitting in some kind of fancy office with everything else. So that mentality really served me well. And then when I left Deloitte and I went to Global Crossing, and then we spun out Asia Global Crossing, I went basically into a startup that IPO'd, and then we spun out another startup, and then that IPO'd. This was back in the telecom rah-rah days, big time. I mean, which, again, in a way, you could say that we were seeing some of that same kind of rah-rah again, leading up to what now is probably a recession, right? But these things cycle, and I think the learning, and particularly the team learning that I got there, was I had taken that, have laptop, will travel. And then I had a boss, as I mentioned, who sent me to Hong Kong, and then had me going all over Asia, and working with teams that were, Chinese, Japanese, whatever it was, and frankly, most of them were a mix. Certainly, many more Asians on the teams that I was leading or that I was working with than there were Western foreigners. So I really got this different perspective, on how to work with people who have different backgrounds, and also how to find common ground. So
this is extremely unique, right? And I think this is the only way to gain this, is basically to work in different work cultures. It's impossible to do it within probably one country, right? Even if you work for different companies, still it's not going to help as much as you spend times in different countries.
for sure.
You have a passion for supporting entrepreneurial CEOs. Where this passion coming from?
I mean, to a great extent, it comes from having been there myself in many different circumstances, both as the sort of founding entrepreneur as well as the appointed intrapreneur, starting startups within bigger companies. Like, for instance, McKinsey. I was brought in to build a startup within McKinsey that was software based and had a separate team. My passion then just sort of carried over when I decided to go from player to coach to being able to have meaningful impact with people that I could relate to. So, and from startup to scale up, which is really where a lot of my coaching happens, there's so much that happens on those journeys. And for me, the other thing I think that is critical is that I see it as a multiplier effect. So when I was building companies, I loved being in that startup or scale-up environment, the energy that was there, and I felt that I could have an impact, right? But the impact was really localized to whatever team I had. It didn't, whatever it was, 5, 10, I managed much larger teams too, 100, 150 people, but that was the impact. Whereas now that I'm coaching and spending more of my time on advisory boards and other things like that, now I'm having impact across many different companies. So there's, instead of just my team of 50 or 100 people, it's several different teams of 50 to 500 people. So there's a real multiplier effect there.
As you already mentioned, you have vast experience in anything from strategy to business consulting, to marketing, to sales, to business development, and all of that brought you to become a full-time coach. And you work with both, as you mentioned, corporates and startups, East and West. How has the business coaching changed in the last 5-10 years?
It's interesting because I don't think it has changed necessarily. I think what's changed is the perception. Though the perception of coaching has changed dramatically, especially in the West, where today, as a CEO, having a coach is much more prevalent. Even I would go beyond to say that it's accepted. It's almost expected. VCs on Sand Hill Road sort of expected. So that's a big change. That's a shift. I also think that coaching in general has perhaps become a little bit more professionalized, but I hesitate to say that it's sort of there yet. I mean, the reality in coaching today is still that it's kind of the Wild West. And I'm using coaching more broadly than just business coaching or scale-up coaching. I mean, you've got life coaches, you've got fitness coaches and health coaches and everything else. And the notion of what is a coach and what qualifies one to be a coach is still pretty wide open. But I think that is starting to get more professionalized.
Let's expand a little bit more on the topic of coaching, right? As you already mentioned, that depends, and there are lots of different coaches. So I bet you hear a lot when people say, "Why do I need a coach?" And what is your best answer to that, and the answer that actually helps you to convert?
Well, I don't know. First of all, I don't know about convert, but it's. I think behind that, the underlying sort of concern or question, particularly with CEOs, and those are all my clients are CEOs. They're heads of their businesses. They're asking themselves, look, if I'm an effective CEO, if I'm good at what I do, isn't getting a coach in some way admitting that I'm deficient? And that's sort of the underlying, I think, concern that a lot of people have. And rather than, responding to that with the platitudes of, you've had, plenty of good quotes out there about no one reaches their full potential without a coach or all this, but those are platitudes, right? For people who have interest, I will talk about, let's talk about real success stories and the role that coaches played in those. I mean, I typically, if someone's interested, I'll talk about Eric Schmidt from Google, who back in 2001, and this is true story that he wrote about in a book that he co-authored. John Doerr, the famous VC, said, Eric, I think you should take on Bill Campbell as a coach. And Eric had that exact attitude. He looked back at John Doerr and said, why would I do that? You hired me because I'm an established CEO. I've got a track record. What do I need with a coach? And he writes in the book, $1 Trillion Coach, which is about Bill Campbell, how his mind was changed within a year and how he came around to realizing that no matter how good you are at your trade, that coach is not about being better than you are. It's about making you better. And Bill Campbell, who's one of my role models, unfortunately I never got to meet him. He passed away in 2016, but he coached Steve Jobs. He coached Jeff Bezos. If these guys, saw value in having a coach, who do you think you are that's not? Now that's a bit of a challenge, right? Some people, on the other hand, it's just clarifying what is a coach, and the distinction that I try to make between a coach and a consultant, as a matter of fact, is that oftentimes CEOs are thinking, oh, a coach is someone who comes and tells me all the right answers. They've got the right answers, and I say no. That's a bit of what you're buying with a consultant, right? A consultant, and a good consultant obviously doesn't know necessarily the right answers to begin with, but helps you figure out the right answers. Whereas a coach, it's much more about asking the right questions, and the value comes in helping this. If it's a CEO that you're coaching, it's helping the CEO that is clearly much more knowledgeable about their business than the coach will ever be. Clearly much better suited to lead their business than the coach probably will ever be. But helping them to, for instance, see what's in their blind spots. Or to consider the fourth or the fifth option when they were ready to just say, hey, there's 3 options, let's just pick one. Right? So it's really expanding the horizons.
Interesting. I have a couple of more follow-up questions on that. But before that, let's make one step back. So you said the perception of coaching changed, especially in the West.
Yeah.
How about Asia and China, particularly where we are now?
Well, I think the West sort of is leading in that trend. It's definitely spilled over here. In many, there's a parallel, I would say, with professional services in general. So when I got here in 2005, consulting was still, it was pretty nascent, and it was one of those things where, circa 2005 in general, I would say, executives were starting to see value in consulting, but they weren't willing to pay for it. Whereas, in the years that followed, I think that started to shift. That they said, okay, there is value, and I'm willing to pay for it. That someone could come in and help me, and I'm going to pay them for something that's non-tangible. Because when I got here in 2005, it seemed like, yeah, I'll pay for something that's tangible. You're going to give me designs for my house. Yes, I realize that those designs are going to cost money, but you're going to advise me on X, Y, or Z, and it's really just me getting your knowledge. Yes, I'd like it, but I'm not going to pay you for it, right? I think coaching, to some extent, falls into a similar pattern where first the value needs to be appreciated, but then there needs to be that realization that, okay, if I'm getting value, that I'm willing to pay for that, right? And there's an exchange. So I do think it's happening here, and I know several coaches. There's a Shanghai coaching circle, which again goes beyond just the kind of work I do. Mine's very niche, but there's plenty of coaches that are doing quite well here, working with all types of clients.
You mentioned about the value, and I want to know, how do you measure the success of coaching? Are there any metrics or KPIs that help you to stay on track?
Yes. Well, the answer is yes. I think that the overarching measure of value for my client, and they're the ones that really have to measure the value ultimately, right? They're the ones that know what kind of value they're getting. But the ultimate measure for them is, are they achieving the goals? And that's whenever I am working through assessing whether there's a coaching opportunity, whether there's a fit, whether I'd like to take on a particular coaching client, that's one of the key elements of that initial discussion is, what do they want to achieve? So 3 years from now, what do they want their business to look like? Or what do they want their role in their business? Most of my clients are the entrepreneur, founder, CEOs, right? So, sometimes it's about, I want the business to be 5X. Sometimes it's about, I want to be able to step back and play a different role in my business. And maybe that's, I want to 3-5 years from now be the chairman of the board as opposed to the CEO, right? So there's a number of different ways that goes. That's the big picture. But since a lot of what I focus on with my clients in coaching is building the disciplines, the systems, the rhythms for scaling a business, then and that's really at the core, because most of my clients, that's where they're struggling. What got them to where they are in their business today isn't going to get them to that next level. That enables me to bring to them scorecards and checklists about those systems, those rhythms, those disciplines, where they can be rating themselves and their business quarter over quarter, and they can see for themselves. It's a self-assessment, but it's important for them to be able to say, you know what, when we started, accountability, for instance, is a good example, was a mess. And now I would say we're an 8 out of 10 on everyone knows what they're accountable for and hold themselves accountable to it. That kind of example.
What is the average time frame that you work with one CEO?
How would I answer that? I launched into coaching 5 years ago. I've got my oldest client was my first client today. So I still coach that client. My average client, over the last 5 years, probably is in the 2 to 3 year range. So that's one way to look at it. I think the more practical way, perhaps, to look at that though is when I decide to take on a client and they decide to take me on as their coach, I always make it very clear that building a business, or for that matter, the entrepreneurial journey, is a marathon, it's not a sprint. And that if we're going to work together and there's going to be real meaningful impact, which is my purpose in being a coach, then the minimum horizon that they should have in their head is 1 year. The reality of the way I work with clients is that, hey, if it's not working for them, we're done. If it's not working for me, we're done. There's no teeth in any contract. We're not handcuffed to each other. But the idea that if you want to start seeing real meaningful results, you can't just say, hey, come in and do one coaching session and then I hope to have meaningful change in my business, right? It's got to be, I become a partner with them in their journey. And so I think that's probably a reasonable way to look at how that works.
Another interesting question that actually I just came up with. since we have the COVID, right, and we have restrictions, and you are not able to meet people in person, and of course, coaching is not supposed to be only offline. But if you compare the sessions online and offline, which are more productive?
That's such a great question, because everyone is struggling or adjusting to the new normal. And frankly, it's not just China, right? All over the world, I think that people are reevaluating what does workspace look like, and how much in-person versus remote work is the right balance, and all those things. So in my sessions, and one way that I always kind of look at it is a core element of my coaching engagements is facilitating the typically quarterly leadership strategy and execution planning sessions, which we used to always just call offsites, right? Because for most of my clients, that was the norm. Was that you get the whole leadership team together, whether they're based in different parts of the world or whether they're actually based in the same part of the world or the same office, get them off-site in a room, and go through this kind of workshop, right? In order to solidify and align around the plans for the business. When COVID hit, all of that had to go online, right? And all of us, not just coaches, obviously, all of us had to learn new tools and figure out how are we going to be able to do the things that we still had to do. You can't stop planning for your business. You can't stop building alignment. You can't stop debating and revising and all those kinds of things that are so important to having an effective leadership team in your business, right? But now you just had to do it online. And back to your question of being effective, here's what I've distilled out of that at the last several years of now doing this and doing a lot of those workshops online. From a productivity standpoint, and productivity meaning, are we getting the outputs we wanted? We wanted to have our strategy revised. We wanted to have our quarterly goals and priorities established and aligned so that those could be cascaded into the rest of the organization, et cetera, et cetera. From that standpoint, online is more productive than offline. And the greatest reason for that is that online, using tools like Mural or Miro, these collaboration tools, everything is natively digital. And I can get 8 members of a leadership team all working on the same whiteboard at the same time, which in a physical space is totally impossible. It's hard enough to get 2 or 3 people at a whiteboard together without them tripping over each other, right? But in digital space, that's not an issue, right? So we can be working through frameworks in real time, and the output, as opposed to just being some scribbles on a whiteboard, the output ends up being this natively digital piece of work product that now can be translated directly into whatever systems we're using for managing accountability, for tracking planning, for setting up meetings, right? I can copy, I can paste, I can do whatever. So it's tremendously productive. Now, what's the downside? The downside clearly is you're not pressing flesh. You're not, when you have these remote meetings, you're not having those lunches and dinners together or late nights at the bar that are creating those human bonds that are also really important. So going forward, what I see happening with both my clients, but also with a lot of the companies that I talk to, is instead of 4 times a year having the leadership team do these big offsites, going to remote places, et cetera, maybe that's once or twice a year. And yes, it's important to get the whole team together. Yes, it's important that they're having those social interactions and that they're bonding, team building, so to speak, right? But for the other 2 or 3 planning sessions, doing it online is actually so much more efficient, and it's much less disruptive to the business too. Because for a 2 or 3 day session, your leaders are out of the office for a week if they have to travel, right? So that can also be pretty disruptive.
A quick one on the assessment. You already start talking about it. So whenever you are picking up the client, what are your requirements? How do you decide that this is the client that I'm going to work with?
So I mentioned some of it. I mean, clearly at the outset, I'm looking for, is this a client that's the right size and in the right point in their journey, sort of the life cycle. So, I specifically like coaching scale-up businesses. What does that mean? Well, it means that they've gotten through sort of that startup phase where most startups are still trying to find product market fit. They're still trying to define who they are to be able to start scaling, right? And most businesses, as you and I both know, don't ever make it out of the startup phase, right? Not easy. But, if they get to the point where now they're a scale-up, they're, 5 million to 500 million in revenue is roughly the sweet spot for the types of clients I coach. But maybe equally as important, they've got a proper leadership team. So it's not the CEO now doing everything, right, or leading everything. They've got other leaders who are truly accountable for key functions in that business. Those are the, if you will, the demographics. But then the psychographics, which are equally as important, or probably even more so, I break it down to 3 questions. And these 3 questions really help me screen out the vast majority of what might be prospective clients. And that is, 1, what are the changes that you want to make where you think a coach might be helpful? And if they're not big enough, if they're not audacious enough, then that's not going to be very meaningful for me or for them, for me to take them on as a coach. And again, they don't have to know all the answers of what they're going to change. It's more, what do they want? Are they looking to 10x their business? Well, those are the kinds of challenges that I like. Second question is, I'll typically ask, on a scale of 1 to 10, how committed are you to making those changes? And it's interesting. It's amazing to me how many people have come to me and said, I'd like to talk to you about coaching. And then I'll get to that question and they'll say, oh yeah, the commitment level, probably a solid 7. And I'm like, wait a minute. Like, if this is a nice to have, then why are we going to go through these motions, right? And if both of those are feeling right, big goals, desire to make significant change in themselves and their business typically, commitment levels high. The last question I'll ask, which is really just to reinforce that this is meaningful to them, is, what's the cost if you don't make these changes? And there's no right answer on that, by the way. But what I'm looking for is, again, that it's not just a nice to have. Because then, they might say they're committed, but if they say, well, the cost is, it might take us a couple extra years to get to IPO. Then you're sort of sitting there going, well, do they really mean it? So those are a few of the questions that I tend to ask in trying to make sure that there's going to be a fit, and that the passion that that I'll bring to that relationship is going to be shared, because that's where those relationships can be most successful.
And my last question for you. So I know that lots of, most of mentors, coaches, trainers, they have their own coaches and mentors. Who are yours?
Too many to go into, like how much time do you have? But I've been lucky. I've been very, very lucky to have several really great coaches and mentors throughout my career. The one that I'll mention that continues to be a really meaningful one for me is Shannon Susko, who was the serial entrepreneur turned coach. And she had some pretty sizable exits. She's typically on the Canada's top 100 entrepreneurs lists on a regular basis. But she turned coach 12 years ago. Actually, I think it's probably 14 now, 14 years or so ago. So several years before me, and she was the one who coached me through becoming a scale-up coach initially. There's an organization called Scaling Up that I joined, and she was my initial coach there and mentor. And then she's founded her own coaching association based on a few of the books that she's written, including Three Hag Way and Metronomics, which are very much core now to a lot of what I do with my clients. And I learned those methodologies directly from her. So that was tremendous impact. I was actually just with her for the better part of a week a few months back when I was in the States, down in San Diego. So that's been very lucky. And again, I knock on wood that I've had the opportunity to learn from people like that, who have done it, who've been really successful, and who can help me to continue to grow, because that's really what it's about.
Absolutely. Scott, thank you so much for sharing, for your insights. I learned way more about coaching, and this is super helpful. And I hope all the listeners and viewers as well pick a lot of interesting insights from you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marianne. Thank you for having me.
I'm gonna see you next time.
Terrific.
Thank you so much. Please like, share, follow, comment, and we see you next time.